Hi everyone, it's Marc the Bruin from counselling-supervision.com.au with another workshop video, this time on transpersonal approaches to counseling. I want to share some stuff with you around that. Now, this was going to be a very long video. I've decided to split it up in about 4 bits. So today I'll be talking about the origins of transpersonal approaches briefly and mention some of the notable names in the transpersonal world. Talk a little bit about key themes and my own experience with transpersonal approaches and leave it there. The rest will be in a session 2 or session 3 in the video. So I'm going to share my screen. I'll look at a couple of different screens altogether to make sure I'm doing this right. So hopefully you will now all see my screen that says Transpersonal Counseling, Integrating Psychology and Spirituality for Holistic Wellbeing. And that's what it's all about. So today, I want to talk about transpersonal counseling as a perspective and a method that goes beyond the traditional focus on pathology, behavior, and ego identity. I think that's what transpersonal stands for. Hey, it's going beyond the personal, and give you a bit of an idea about that one. So what does transpersonal approach to counseling, or do transpersonal approach to counseling do? Well, they point towards states and work with states that go beyond the individual selves. So aspects of human life that go beyond ourselves, and call that spirituality, whatever you want to call it. So at that core, transpersonal approaches explore the spiritual, existential, and more expansive dimensions of the human experience. And by doing that, while doing that, they integrate things from psychology, for sure, philosophy and spiritual traditions, East and West, and place a lot of emphasis on things like meaning and purpose, connection, transformation, transcendence. So traditional therapies have often focused on symptom reduction mainly. Transpersonal approaches do that too, but they're equally concerned with things like growth, wholeness, and the unfolding of our human potential. So the key features of it, in essence, is, well, spirituality is a legitimate and important dimension of well-being. You need to do that. Let's explore all these non-ordinary or altered states of consciousness, and it could be things like meditation, dreams, peak experiences, flow, but also psychedelics and other things that can enhance our non-ordinary states. It focuses on transcendence, this idea of self-realizing, and also on interconnectedness of others with ourselves, others, the world, the cosmos, God, divinity, Buddha, Krishna, whatever name you want to give it, the universe. And the methods it uses are more integrative. So things like guided imagery, mindfulness, but also to things like breath work and creative symbolic practices. So in its very essence, transpersonal approaches invite clients to view their struggles and their experiences with a broader context of growth, transformation, transcendence, the movement through states, and connecting with something larger than selves. So we'll have a talk about that. I'm going to bring the next screen up already. Now, my interest got piqued very early in the piece. My mum was an avid book collector on anything to do other than normal stuff. I always think she was into homeopathy very early on in the 60s and the 70s already. She had all sorts of stuff, read about all sorts of things, but mainly spirituality. Spirituality and what else is there to life. So she had books and books and books on things like comparative religion studies, to find out where the common elements of religions are. Things like reincarnation, life before death, life after death, life between lives, anything to do with mysticism, esoterics, parapsychology, you name it. She probably had it. She had a proper library. And as a young kid, I got very interested in sort of staring at some of those books and picking them up and reading them. And that piqued my interest in doing it more. So I've had my own journey into spirituality. I was born and raised a Catholic, but never really practicing, very liberal, but was very much interested in this. There's got to be something else out there than just what we can see and notice here. So the sum is more than, the whole is more than the sum of its parts, that belief. I've always had that very strongly. And as a young man, teenager, but later on as well, did lots of workshops, went to lots of seminars, listened to lots of people, read lots of books. And as a lawyer later on and a counselor now, there was also this evidence-based part of me that says, hey, bring me the proof of this stuff working, of this being correct. And I always had trouble reconciling the two. There was this spiritual side of me that says, yeah, let's go, but let's philosophize about stuff. And then there was a side of me that said, yeah, but does it work? Where can I find the proof of that working? And I've always been looking for a bridge. I think transpersonal approaches in my current career in mental health are that bridge to a very high degree. So let's talk about a lot of stuff. So I'm going to keep it brief. The transpersonal approaches emerged in the 60s and 70s, give or take, as a fourth force in counseling after psychoanalysis, behaviorism, and humanism, or humanistic philosophy and psychology. And it was rooted in humanistic psychology for starters, but then expanded itself to include things like spirituality, altered states, and transcendence as well. Very strongly influenced by Eastern traditions along the lines of Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, but also by mystical traditions of the West. Carl Jung, I'll mention him very soon, Christian mysticism, Sufism, Kabbalah, you mentioned it. There's all sorts of other teachings as well that influence transpersonal approaches. So when you look at the notable figures in transpersonal, that's that number 5 there. I'm going to stop and stand still and talk about that a little bit more deeply. You can see how it kind of developed. So the first person to mention is Carl Jung. He was obviously a psychoanalytical trained person together with Sigmund Freud, moved away from Freud's stuff later on. So he's not really a transpersonal person in that sense, but he was definitely a precursor to it because he emphasized this collective unconscious, these archetypes, and the process of individuation, you're becoming our fullest selves, whatever that might have meant. And he was one of the first that saw psychological symptoms as calls from the psyche towards a greater level of wholeness. And techniques and tools that he used were things like dream analysis, archetypal and symbolic meanings, active imagination, dialogue with inner figures or with images, myth and symbol works, or drawing from cultural and spiritual traditions, and the exploration of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences. I don't believe in coincidences, but that's my transpersonal view as guidance. That's what Jung did. Abraham Maslow was very much another exponent of transpersonal approaches. The hierarchy of needs, most of us in the counseling field know that one, ultimately culminating in self-actualization and self-transcendence, as he talked about it later on. He studied peak experiences, so moments of this profound connection, this sense of awe, this sense of unity, and said this is actually vital for mental health and flourishing in our lives. And what he did was advocate for psychology to study the healthy people, the most fulfilled people, the well people, not just pathology, which later on people like Martin Seligman and Mike Csikszentmihalyi studied further on with positive psychology. Maslow's tools and techniques, if you want to call them that way, he encouraged cultivating conditions for peak experiences, so openness, creativity, values-based living. He used a lot of humanistic techniques like empathy, authenticity, and unconditional positive regard, and then used that in helping people to clarify their values so that they could live their lives in alignment with higher purpose. Now, I hope I pronounced this guy's name correctly, but the third person was Roberto Assagioli. He is the founder of psychosynthesis, which is an integrative model combining psychoanalysis with spiritual growth. He saw the psyche as being layered with a lower unconscious, instincts and traumas, a middle unconscious where our day-to-day functioning sits, and a higher unconscious where creativity, intuition, spiritual states live, and then the self at the center of that all. And therapy and Assagioli's view aimed to harmonize all these aspects towards unity and wholeness. So many of his techniques, similar to the other ones, guided imagery, visualization, symbolic journeys, ideal models, people that you live up to or that you would like to live up to, or that you think are, the ones to follow. Disidentification exercises, I'll talk about a little bit later on, but learning to step back from thoughts, feelings, and roles. Symbolic and creative methods like art, writing, movement, and meditation to connect with a higher self. Then a fourth one, an important guy in my life, because that's the first time I really came into contact with transpersonal approaches proper, is Stanislav Grof. He was a psychiatrist, and uh, he was one of the first people to pioneer an experiment, I would think, with psychedelic assisted therapy, early LSD research. So that's different, and came up with holotropic breath work later on when psychedelics became a bit more restricted. He saw crises not as breakdowns per se, also, but not per se, but often as spiritual emergencies, something going on a spiritual level that needed, transforming, that had transformative potential. So he was the person to map non-ordinary states of consciousness as gateways to healing, and did a lot of work in that. So holotropic breath work, which is a form of very fast breathing that gets you in a different state because you pretty much start to hyperventilate, combined with some music, allowed people to access different states. He did a lot of body work to release trauma that's stored in the body. That's been researched since, quite a bit. Mandala drawing for integration of experiences, was one of his things, and ultimately that spiritual emergency stuff. So normalizing things like that and guiding them as transformative for clients, that was part of his approach. Fifth person, there's two more. Ken Wilber was a contemporary one. He's still around. He was a philosopher more than a practitioner, and an integral theorist. So he came up with this integral theory, a framework that synthesized psychology, spirituality, science, and culture. And he proposed that human development doesn't only include cognitive and emotional stages, but also these transpersonal and spiritual stages. And we should, work with all of them. So ultimately, he said we need to work with the four quadrants of our human existence: the individual and the collective, the inner and the outer. Sounds pretty cool to me. He was not very much a practitioner, so techniques and tools, not quite. He was more a theorist, but his work influenced the practice of things like integrative life practice, body, mind, spirit, and shadow work. And he was a proponent of meditation and contemplative practices as central growth tools, and the 3-2-1 process. That's his. Don't ask, look it up. 3-2-1 process, shadow work techniques, and engaging with disowned parts of ourselves. That's what he stood for as well. And the last one, you don't hear often about this guy, but I read up on him and got a book of his, was Seymour Boorstein. He died in 2018. He was a psychiatrist, a clinical professor at University, I think, of San Francisco, and he was also a practicing psychotherapist. He was very instrumental in the transpersonal world, and his main aim was to make transpersonal concepts accessible to mainstream clinicians, emphasizing the practicality of it and the clinical integration that he thought was necessary. So he says this is about integration, not about replacement. He didn't view transpersonal therapy as a separate modality. He says this is actually a dimension of therapy that we can add to existing approaches. And he talked about a spectrum of consciousness. So we shouldn't just address pathology and ego issues and identity issues, but also higher states of awareness, spiritual openings, and existential concerns. For him, the therapist's stance ideally would be openness to spiritual perspectives, if the client was willing to go there as well, to have some humility. We don't know it all, we can't know it all, and to be aware of our own growth, to also grow ourselves and be aware of our own growth. But he also emphasized that whatever we were doing in that realm had to have clinical grounding. So established assessments and treatment methods, while also allowing space for transpersonal exploration, if you will. He did a lot of work along the lines of meditation, mindfulness, imagery, visualization, dream work, peak and mystical experience. So he integrated a lot of stuff from the other authors and key people, but also the self practice for the practitioner. You need to look at yourself. So, and we can all do that. Hey, like this is a reflective question potentially for you. When you think about your own training and background as a counselor, as a psychotherapist, where have you seen hints of spirituality and the transcendent being included or excluded in your life, in your training, in your practice? Where has that popped up? Would be a good one to start looking, because my guess would be that there would already be transpersonal elements in the way you've studied, in what you've done, or in your own life. It's might as well start using it. So those are, the first bits and pieces of transpersonal approaches to counseling. Already told you I'm going to split this up in about 3 or 4 videos. Key themes, key people. Next time we'll look at some of the techniques and tools. We'll add some of the criticisms. Again, another 2 or 3 videos probably, just to keep it interesting. So I'll stop sharing now to make it a little bit more easy for myself. And yeah, I hope that was useful. As always, I'm open to suggestions, whatever you want to hear more about. I'm happy to research this and do a video on it. So let me know. This is very much a pet topic for me. I love transpersonal stuff, so I can talk about that all the time. But if you got something else that you want to know about, let me know, and we'll talk about it. And otherwise, stay tuned for video number 2 on transpersonal approaches. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you.